thank you all so much for coming. I seem to spend an awful lot of my life talking about Boris these days, which wasn't something that I quite expected. But the subject tonight is, would Britain be safe in Boris's hands? So I just want you to all imagine here for a moment that Boris was in charge of, or in possession of the nuclear codes, that he was in control of the security services and the armed forces, and he was in charge of a major crisis, because obviously that's the sort of thing that Prime Minister has to think about quite often. And I'd just quite like to, because this is very much an exercise that, with me trying to find out more as well, I'd like a vote, just straight away, as to who of you here think it would be great to have Boris in charge of all those things. Perhaps if you could put your hand up, if you can imagine a Boris administration. Okay, so I reckon that's probably about half of you. Okay, right, well that's interesting. Can you put up your hands again? I'd just like to see how that goes between men and women, because quite often there's...
Put your hand up.
Come on, there were more of you before. Okay, actually, well, that's fairly even then, because quite often it's more women than men, which always interests me. Perhaps we'll do that vote again at the end of the evening, or the end of my little discussion, and see whether it's any different. So, what I'd like to do is look at a Boris, or the idea of Boris being Prime Minister in sort of quite a systematic way. And what I've done is I've boiled down to all the qualities and characteristics that one might hope to see in a Prime Minister. And then each of those qualities, and I've chosen sort of 4 umbrella qualities if you like, I'm going to give a sort of Boris factor top trump score at the end, and I'd quite like you to do the same thing once I've discussed it. Now, as you know, or may not know, I don't know, but I wrote a book about Boris Johnson. The first edition came out in 2011, and then the paperback, which I've got here, came out in 2012. In that book, I tried to be, and was actually credited with being very, very fair and balanced, which is what I wanted to do. But it was the first time that anyone had attempted a serious kind of scrutiny of Boris, even though by then, and even more so now, he was a serious politician, a senior politician perhaps one should say, but one with very, very serious ambitions. I mean, ever since I first met him, which was the beginning of the 1990s, I knew that he wasn't an ordinary person in any way. He certainly wasn't an ordinary journalist, which is what I was, and he quite clearly had ambitions to go to the very top. In fact, I think I was the very first person in 2002 to write a piece in the Independent on Sunday, look it up if you like, suggesting or asking people, inviting people to imagine him on the steps of Downing Street, a bit like the exercise we're doing tonight. And it was, people thought I was insane. What a ridiculous idea. They said, no, of course he doesn't want that because he's he's shambolic, he's a buffoon, all the rest of it, but I don't think anyone thinks it's such an absurd idea now. Anyway, so let's have a look at the 4 categories, and let's have a look and see how Boris scores. So the first category, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to have a look at is likeability. So popularity is actually quite a good thing if you want to govern. And you can ask Gordon Brown about that and see what he might want to say. Of course, he was never elected as Prime Minister. Now, on this front, I would actually say that Boris is nothing short of a genius. Okay, I really would say he's won 2 elections in London, which is traditionally a Labour-leaning city. He's loved by the apolitical. My cab driver on the way here said, I'm not interested in politics whatsoever. And he said, who are you talking about? Boris Johnson. Oh, well, now, he's an interesting fellow, he said. So, he attracts the apolitical, the young. He has a disproportionate following amongst the young, students in particular. The normal can't be bothered brigade. The envious, there are plenty of men out there who'd rather like to be Boris Johnson, I've met some of them. And the fun-seeking, who'd like to join in with some of that fun. So obviously during the Olympics, he excelled. He wowed the crowd at Hyde Park, if you remember, got them really going, a bit like a revivalist preacher. He did all that dad dancing in the stadium, everyone thought that was great. I mean, he cheered up the nation more than some sort of, container full of Prozac. Perhaps the high point was when he got stuck on the zip wire. Remember that? the Union Jacks, the socks showing, the goosey flesh between socks and trouser leg. Brilliant piece of theatre, I think you'd all agree, but perhaps quite a lot of you don't know that when he went on that zip wire, as always, people asked him, well, how much do you weigh, Mr. Johnson? And he gave a ridiculous answer, which meant that apparently he was always going to get stuck. There was no way he was going to be able to make it down to the bottom without getting stuck. Now ask yourself, why would he want to get stuck? I mean, David Cameron said through gritted teeth, normally politicians, that would be kind of, the end if they got stuck. How undignified, how embarrassing, how humiliating. But actually, for Boris, it was a triumph. I remember being phoned up. I was actually on holiday in France on that very day, and I was phoned up on holiday, and they managed to track me down by 20 different, or rather, media organisations from 20 different countries. So not 20 media organisations in Britain, but from all over the world. And I remember the Washington Post was one of them, and saying, oh, gee, our editors just wish we had such a great fun mayor in DC. I mean, he became a global brand on that day. Do you think he hadn't worked that out beforehand? He had, believe me. Obviously, don't give the wrong weight in that way. So, and if you want to look further back as to why he's so popular and likeable, have any of you seen him on Have I Got News For You? Maybe a bit old for some of you very young ones, worth having a look at on YouTube. In one episode, he made a big thing about supposedly having tried cocaine as a youth, and then saying, well, actually, maybe it was icing sugar, and everyone had a good joke. And then he said the same thing again, that was 2005, same thing again to GQ in 2007, and several other times between then and now. Now he said it again this week. I don't know whether you saw that in the Observer. So when he's got a good joke, there's no point in just using it once. You should use it several times, as he did. But it meant that he got rid of a subject that is often very difficult for politicians. Think about Bill Clinton and his not inhaling. Well, perhaps don't think about Bill Clinton and his not inhaling, but also various Eton and St Paul's boys that one can think of and won't actually mention just now. So he's, that makes kind of endearing, special, different, funny. It's all, good stuff, isn't it? And then his jokes. I mean, quite often they are his jokes, and quite often they're someone else's jokes. And someone told me today they went to a speech that he gave recently all about some a much more amusing story than mine about a cabbie, and to great effect. It turned out that unfortunately someone in the audience, that incident had actually happened to them, and there was Boris saying it was happening to him. So he uses material from wherever he can find it. So we all like a laugh, and Boris supplies a few of them. But there was a downside to that. And as you may know, for several years, between 2001 and 2008, he was Conservative MP for Henley. And in 2008, he stepped down to become mayor. Now, initially, he was invited to apply for that seat because they thought he was funny. But then when he came along and gave talks to the constituents, they got a little bit less enamoured of this funniness. For instance, when he was asked seriously, well, what do you think about the state of the NHS? Obviously, always a subject that exercises everybody. He went into a whole spiel about how when his wife had given birth and she'd fallen asleep and he'd eaten her toast and there'd been no more toast. And so his biggest policy would be more toast for maternity wards in the NHS. Again, quite funny, but this was a serious question, and that was his response. And there were quite a few other sort of flippant things about subjects that people feel very upset about, very anxious about, think very seriously about. One of them was the Iraq War. Again, they got rather cross with him because he made lots of jokes about the Iraq War and seemed to change his mind all the time. So, funny enough, or maybe not very funny enough, in Henley, quite a few people spoilt their ballot papers in that selection process. A few people walked out of the selection meeting that night and never went back to the party. And a handful of people left the Conservative Party for good and have never gone back, thinking, well, if we can elect someone like this as our MP, then it's not worth having anything to do with anymore. And the local president, sadly now late Maggie Pullen, a very nice woman, said she was devastated when Boris got that seat. And although she worked with him all the time he was an MP, she never got over it because she said that compared with Michael Heseltine, who was Boris's predecessor, he was never a serious MP, he never took Henley seriously, he never took his duties seriously, either within the constituency or in the Commons. And somehow you stop laughing when you're trying to save a local hospital and your MP is messing about and not actually taking it seriously at all. The jokes kind of stop at that point. And as I say, the jokes never really got going for anyone because when he went for that seat, obviously a plum seat, if you're Conservative, fantastic, lovely majority, just outside London. Boris has his constituency home nearby. What a lovely place to be. When he went for that seat, it was fiercely contested, as you would imagine, between the different Conservative candidates who wanted to be the MP. So there were two other front runners to become the Conservative candidate. One was a male lawyer, clever, witty, considered to be on the fast track in the party. Another was a female lawyer, bit of a theme here. Also very impressive, good speaker, done lots of good stuff. But the male lawyer, David Platt, was expected to win the contest. But then some rumours started going around, and then some anonymous letters started going around saying that he was gay, and even worse, that he was a Europhile. In those days, it was not that long ago, being a gay Europhile was about as bad as you could get in the Conservative Party. And his chances, he was considered the shoo-in, evaporated. And he's never contested the seat since. This experience scarred him so much. He's never gone back now. I don't know where all that briefing was coming from, where those anonymous letters were coming from. But there were also anonymous letters saying that the female contestant, the leading contestant, Jill Andrew, also a lawyer, was a drunken and promiscuous, and even worse, a friend of Cherie Blair. Now again, where did these letters come from? But various people got them, including the local newspaper, all anonymous, and conveniently for Boris, both candidates who were initially further ahead than him, or popular than him locally, disappeared, and he got the seat. Well, I'm not pinning blame on anyone, but a lot of people never got over that. It left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And it's just sort of interesting that this sort of thing tends to accompany Boris. So if you look back at his exercises in trying to become president of the Union in Oxford, for instance, fairly similar things went on then. If you also look at when he used to be a journalist, and I was a journalist with him on the Telegraph, for instance, and our editor then was Max Hastings, which some of you may have heard of, He was a great supporter of Boris in those days, but now he writes pieces in the Daily Mail fairly regularly saying that if Boris did ever become Prime Minister, he would get on the first plane out of the country and not come back. Well, what's changed? And in fact, another editor, doesn't want to speak names, but again, we both worked with him, said that the closer you get to Boris, the less you like him. And that seems to be quite a common view. I don't tend to hang out with Conservative ministers very often, but quite recently, or over the last two years, I suppose, various John Major era ministers, so men of a certain age, have contacted me out of the blue and said, Boris must be stopped. Well, I don't know why they think that's my job, that's probably theirs. But, I've been quite taken aback by this, and it's happened several times now. But anyway, so perhaps he isn't quite as likeable as he may seem, and we'll sort of come on to that again under a different category. But one thing that he has done brilliantly, yet again, as I say, the man is a genius, is you may have heard that he's written a book about Winston Churchill. Funny enough, I'm writing one about Clementine Churchill, complete coincidence. His book is out this week, and it's called, well, it has very, very big letters, Boris Johnson, and then it says the Churchill factor, so who has the Churchill factor isn't quite clear, and then it says how one man made history. Well, I suggest, if you want to know about Boris, read this book, because there's not an awful lot about Winston Churchill in it, but it's a masterpiece of subliminal messaging. So now, in our heads, Boris Churchill, Winston Johnson, it's all the same. And indeed, if you go through this book, as I have, I've just reviewed it for a paper this weekend, you will see how many times he says this, this, and this, and this about Churchill, and you could take Churchill out and it's all about him. So, again, he's using other people's likeability to boost his own. He's very clever, he's a lovely writer. I'm going to give, in my top trumps game, a popularity Boris factor of 9.5, because he's incredibly popular, except with those people who've worked with him, or had to depend on him, rely on him, and then he tends to be less popular. So please, ladies and gentlemen, if you could mentally make your own score, that would be very good. And we'll go on to the next subject, trust. I think it's very important to trust your Prime Minister. Most people probably agreed on that, including my cab driver. I had a fantastic conversation with him. He said, I'm not sure I can trust him. That's the one thing I want to know. Okay, well, the first thing you think of is Marina, obviously. Does Marina trust her husband? Well, she is a marvellous woman. I met her in Brussels, and she's really a very marvellous person. But I imagine sometimes when Boris is late home, she might imagine certain things. I know that at various points over the last few years, she's gone to work without her wedding ring, and that her colleagues have known that this is not something to ask her about. Now, maybe this doesn't matter anymore. Maybe what politicians get up to between the sheets is totally irrelevant. Maybe we're going towards the French system where you don't find out that someone's got a second family, secret second family, until they turn up at the funeral. If you remember with François Mitterrand, that's what happened, that no one talked about it. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we were sort of infantile about it before. But then again, maybe it does matter, because we're talking about a Prime Minister, and we're talking about someone who wants to be Prime Minister, and he thinks his biggest quality is because he's so authentic. So there comes that genius again, because a lot of people think, well, Boris is so authentic. So let's have a look as to how authentic he is. Last year, 2013, there was an extraordinary judgment from the Court of Appeal. And this was after a case where persons unknown funded a case trying to stop the newspapers writing about someone's love child. And it wasn't said in the court papers who the someone was, apart from the fact that the love child was discussed in a book called Just Boris. I only discussed one love child in that book, so it became pretty clear that the whole judgment was about Boris. Now, the Court of Appeal has subsequently obviously confirmed this, but their judgment, which was an extraordinary judgment, was that the way that he conducts his extramarital affairs and his casual conception of at least 2 children with various lovers was so reckless in the extreme, that it raised doubts about his fitness for office. His disregard, the judges continue, remember these are senior judges, of other people's feelings was so severe that it constituted a matter of public interest, and therefore the newspapers were right to publish stories about his love child with an art consultant. And that goes against the whole grain of the way things are going at the moment, obviously greater privacy, Levson and all the rest of it. So this was a very sort of a landmark, an extraordinary judgment, if you like. And also remember, it was the Court of Appeal, it wasn't the Synod of the Church of England. They were not being moralistic, they were simply talking about whether or not someone's conduct was so extreme that the public needed to know about it, because this was a man who was, as we know, seeking the highest office in the land, and so it was a matter of public interest. The extraordinary thing is that hardly anyone, I mean, I wrote about it, but hardly anyone else wrote about this judgment. There's no judgment like that in recent times of any senior serving politician. And there's nothing as excoriating as that. You look in the law books, believe me, I did a law degree, I know lots of lawyers, there was nothing. That was extraordinary. So how did Boris not get floored by that? I mean, how did Houdini Boris get away with it? Well, partly because he's very chummy with a lot of newspaper editors and does this kind of cajoling, charming thing with them, and they just didn't run anything about it. Imagine if some judgment about Ed Miliband, David Miliband, or David Cameron, anyone except Boris. I bet most of you didn't know about that judgment, and yet it's extraordinary. Okay, so that's his private life. Let's talk about how his private life might affect his public one, and how is he in City Hall? Has he been a good mayor? Has he been a trustworthy mayor? Okay, since he became mayor in 2008, he has been officially reprimanded at least twice by the UK Statistical Authority, which is a watchdog that tries to make sure that politicians are completely lying through their teeth. Just lying a little bit through their teeth, but a little bit of lying might be acceptable, but this was going too far for them, and the first time that they got extremely cross, they said that he's undermined public trust. And the second time, basically, they said, well, you're making these figures up because he was claiming that he'd come up with a scheme for youth reoffending that basically solved the problem like a sort of magic wand, and everything was going to be marvellous because he'd come up with some new way of stopping people going back to crime. It was so marvellous that the scheme was closed down soon afterwards because it was such a failure, and the figures were completely, or at least mostly, unfounded. And it's not just those figures that have alarmed the UK Statistical Authority, but there have been other rows over his figures to do with cycling accidents, housing starts, police numbers, you name it. A lot of the figures have turned out to be a little bit on the wobbly side. I know Boris, as I say, from back in the 90s when he was a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, not quite a paper of record, but some paper then at least, maybe not now. That one expected to see something truthful being printed in. But his stories, immensely creative, wonderful, sometimes extremely informative, but not always, sometimes a little bit over-creative. They were more propaganda sometimes than news, and this became abundantly clear. And James Landale, now BBC Deputy Political Editor, then in Brussels for the Times, wrote a little poem about Boris. Ask James Landale about this if you ever meet him. The poem started, Boris told such dreadful lies, it made one gasp and stretch one's eyes. So this isn't just a sort of one-off theme, I think it's fair to say. And I'd just like you to think about him being in charge of the security services and the armed forces and the nuclear codes, and being in charge in a crisis, and also just ask yourselves, would you like to be stranded in a desert with this fellow? So put that thought in your mind. So trust. My top trump score, my Boris factor, being generous, I'm going to give him 2 out of 10. Please, award him higher if you think that's right to do. Third, quality, likability. I think we all quite like to like our Prime Ministers, and they certainly benefit from being liked or nice. My mum seems to think David Cameron's very nice, for instance, but she doesn't like Alex Salmond. And I know a lot of my Scottish friends didn't vote yes because they didn't like Alex Salmond. So yeah, likability is very important. And there is a sort of test for that, isn't there? Would you spend an evening in a pub with this person? So, would you spend an evening in the pub with Boris Johnson? Well, he probably would have some good jokes and he'd be quite fun, and so maybe one would. But I have to tell you something else. He never buys a drink, ever. I mean, I have known him for a very long time, and he's earned an awful lot of money in that time, and he's notoriously stingy. Even his greatest fans agree with this one. When he was in Brussels with us, he was one of the best paid journalists, and his expenses claims are also fairly legendary. But just after I arrived in Brussels, an official from the European Parliament came up to me and said, well, Sonia, you need to know this. And I said, what? Well, Boris might ask to borrow 50 quid or something off you. Just don't, because if you do, you might never get it back. And, okay, he did once ask if he could borrow. I think it was a tenner, actually, and I felt rather sort of mean saying no, but I didn't lend it. Maybe I should have done, but anyway. He was famous. There was this pub near the Commission in Brussels called Kitty O'Shea. It's quite famous, and everyone goes there. All the journalists, quite a lot of the MEPs if they're there, officials. Friday night's a big thing. We will always be there. We were quite, we were away from home. We have a little bit of camaraderie. Boris would occasionally come in. He would have one drink. Someone else would buy it. He would pummel you for information, and then when it might possibly be his turn for a round, he would go. The other thing about Boris is, as we saw when he was going for the seat in Henley, he doesn't like to lose, and he doesn't like sort of scrutiny. And when I wrote that book, when it came out in 2011, it was my first book, and I wrote it in the shed, washing my garment. I had one of those little office shed things. And just before, well, not long before it came out, I started hearing these rumours that various things were being said about me, and I sort of thought, well, no, how ridiculous, that, this can't be true. And then on the day the book came out, I was invited on a radio programme. I was given a slight tip-off as to what was going to happen, and sure enough it did happen. I was asked on air directly, well, not asked, a statement was put to me, so you wrote this book because you had an affair with him and he wouldn't marry you. Right. No. What do you say? Something like that? No, I didn't have an affair with him. I don't fancy Boris Johnson. I've never fancied Boris Johnson. I never wanted him to marry him, and if he wanted to marry me, I certainly wouldn't accept him. What do you say? Where is this coming from? It happened again. And then various journalists came up to me and said, we're being told that if we're seen speaking to you, or if you're writing about the book, then we'll never have access to the mayor again. And then I was told that an interview I did with the BBC wasn't going to be broadcast, and then it was, and then it wasn't, and then it was, and then it wasn't, and then it was. This went on for some time, and eventually it was. And then I came back from a weekend abroad, and I saw my name all over Twitter, and it was all over the front page of The Guardian, because someone had leaked some emails to The Guardian between City Hall and the Director General's Office of the BBC, where City Hall was saying, if you run that interview with Sonia Purnell, we will basically get all our friendly editors to wage World War III on you, on TV licence and all the rest of it. And someone at the BBC, nothing to do with me, leaked these to The Guardian, and there they were on the front page. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes. And what I can only think of is that because he couldn't find fault with anything in the book, I was unbelievably, neurotically, obsessively careful that I could back up the dotted I and crossed T. He had to try and undermine me, or persons on his behalf, persons unknown rather, had to undermine me. That's a pretty unpleasant feeling if you've ever been on the end of something like that. And I feel quite depressed in the 21st century that a way of getting at a woman is suggesting that she's a woman scorned and that I did it because he wouldn't marry me. I mean, it sounds pathetic, but it can still also be very, very damaging. There were lots of innuendos in various friendly papers, all this sort of thing. And there have been other sort of incidents of intimidation subsequently. So, not very nice. And of course, you probably all know about the Darius Guppy thing. I mean, I don't know quite what to make of it. Yes, he agreed to try to help his friend beat up an inquisitive journalist, but nothing ever happened and the journalist was never beaten up. But again, it was, at best, a lapse in judgment. So, likeability. Yes, extremely likeable, again, until you get close. So I think my Boris factor here would perhaps be 3. Okay, and I'd like to know what you think. Okay, finally, a Prime Minister needs to be a good manager, needs to be able to run things well, the country needs to be able to operate well. So it needs to be a good statesman in a crisis, to utter the right words in the right tone, needs to have some concrete achievements to point to, improving schools or improving economy, whatever it is. So let's have a look at Boris and how he's performed as mayor. Because actually, when he was an MP, he was a bit of a failure, really. I mean, I've just talked about what happened in Henley, but he was known for not being a good performer in the Commons chamber. And Boris, actually, totally honest about this, described his performances in the chamber as crap. So he's a really good TV performer, but less so when you've got, the Labour bench is right in front of you, and they're not going to give you the same sort of break that the TV audience are going to a celebrity, if you like. But anyway, let's get back to London. How good a mayor has he been? Well, he's been a really good figurehead, hasn't he? Again, the Olympics, dad dancing, the zip wire. Everyone says the London Olympics were amazing. They were amazing. I live in London. It was fantastic. It was brilliant. And he was the figurehead of it. He didn't bring the Olympics here, and he didn't do any of the organising, really, but he was a great figurehead, and I don't want to take that away from him. London is also a booming city. It is probably the world city now. Certainly has that feeling, it has that attitude, it has the confidence. I lived quite a lot of my life in London that it used not to have. Now, whether that is Boris or whether it isn't is a moot point, but he's not done anything to take away that confidence, or nothing is taking it away yet, put it that way. I mean, it's a culturally rich and exciting place to live. But what has he done in his own direct areas of responsibility? So policing obviously come directly underneath the mayoral remit, and crime is down, as it is everywhere. But policing per se has been a bit of a problem in London. I don't know how closely you follow it, but we're on our 4th Metropolitan Police Commissioner since Boris took over. The Met has been in turmoil over all sorts of things. Phone hacking, he very much backed the wrong horse in that. He wasn't really on the case with the death, if you remember, of Ian Thompson, the newspaper salesman. There is still a feeling that the Met has not got its house in order. But I think the most important thing was the 2011 riots. Again, they were pretty scary in London, and Boris was on holiday, and I wouldn't say anyone shouldn't go on holiday, absolutely should. But he was in the mountains in Canada where there was no phone reception, so it took quite a long time to get him to begin with. Whether you think a mayor should be somewhere where there isn't very good phone reception, I'll leave that to you to decide. But anyway, when they did get hold of him, they said, well, these terrible riots in London, we don't know what's going to happen. And he said, well, okay, well, I'm not coming back. You deal with it. Again, was that the right decision? I'll leave that for you to decide. In the end, he did come back. He did fly back because everyone else was coming back from their holiday. It was going to look pretty bad if he didn't. And he went down to Clapham. And again, you look on YouTube and you see how did he cope with the people there. He's had a really, really miserable time. And in particular, there was a hairdresser who had been in her salon and a brick had come through the window and there were no police, and she did not know whether she was going to get out of there alive. And it was scary as hell. And she was trying to explain to him what that was like, and he cannot quite get that Boris smirk off his face. So he cannot, he's a great good news guy, but this was bad news. This was really, really fundamental stuff, and he did not deal with it, and they started to jeer him and boo him. He wasn't used to that, and he scuttled around the corner pretty damn quick. Then, of course, the PR genius came back to the fore, because he grabbed a broom from somewhere, held it in the air, almost like sort of, the charge of a light brigade. Well, wrong analogy, but, some sort of cavalry charge. And he won back some of the sort of ground that he had lost. But it was a very, very dangerous moment, and he did not handle the riots well. And that was a really, really big test. So we should learn quite a lot from that. Okay, pollution, another big thing in London. Really bad. I live in London, it is really bad. And it's getting worse, and nothing is being done. He's using this kind of glue thing out of backs of lorries at night to try and stick the particles to the surface of the road, rather than actually thinking, should we really have this much traffic? So 4,000 people a year die in London from pollution. That figure is not going down, by the way. Congestion, okay, you have it bad in New York, as I now know, but we also have it very bad in London. It's not getting any better. Transport, yes, I would say it is more efficient. I really like the new Circle Line trains. They're very nice. Next time you're in London, check them out. And it probably is more efficient. I think a lot of those efficiencies came from the investment put in by Ken Livingstone, but they have continued under Boris undoubtedly. But we do have the highest fares in the world, pretty much. Do we have the best transport system in the world? I don't think so. Crossrail, obviously going to be pretty good at some point when it comes in. Again, that was Ken Livingstone's investment and idea. Housing, we have a terrible housing crisis in London, and eventually that may actually take the heart out of London. It may stop being the culturally rich and exciting place it is, because no one except Russian oligarchs will be able to afford to live there. I have no idea how my kids will ever be able to afford anything there. This is not good in the city. It's not healthy. It is not good long term. However much we might preen ourselves about how house prices are going up now, it isn't good. It's not good for society, and nothing really is being done about this. One of his sort of dodgy stats areas is housing starts. There are not enough houses being built, and he is very largely responsible for that. Not completely, obviously, but he could have done an awful lot more. Okay, so the cycling, of course, the cycling mayor, he was elected. That's why there's a picture of him on a bike on the book. He was elected the cycling mayor. It was going to be this nirvana where we were all going to cycle everywhere and it was going to be totally safe. And yet 16 people on average are dying every year on London's roads. And that compares with quite a few years in Paris where no cyclists die. And so this is not good enough, and the improvements we've promised and promised and promised, and they're still really slow, and we still don't have them. And someone only on Friday last week, a week ago, a German woman coming, she lived in London for 3 months, went under a tipper truck and died on Monday morning. This is happening too often, and more should be done, not least because that would help congestion and pollution and all the rest. Now, bikes. The hire bikes, great, really fun, really love them, but poorly managed, and they're costing, we're getting to this figure, that they cost nearly £250 million now. Now, they're great fun, but are they worth nearly £250 million? A lot of other cycling schemes in other cities are self-funding, they're self-sufficient. Ours have cost an awful lot of money, and he promised that it wouldn't cost. That's the taxpayer, you, not just Londoners, by the way, you guys are also paying for that ultimately. Other cities, as I say, that don't cost the taxpayer a bean. There have been other sort of projects. We have a cable car thing which starts nowhere and goes nowhere. Again, he said, would not cost the taxpayer any money. I think it's about 40 million it's actually cost and no one goes on it. And then there is the ArcelorMittal tower which he put up for the Olympics, and no one goes up that either. So not a great use of public money. The early days in City Hall were a shambles. Again, some of that's written about in the book. It is much more well organised now. He's certainly learned something about that, and he's got a team now that can more or less carry on with stuff. But he's still known as the do-little mayor. He's done surprisingly little in 6 years. So as a manager, my Boris factor top trump score, I don't know, 3, 4? So at the very best, I'm giving Boris half marks, 20 out of 40. And if we look at those sort of 4 subject areas, if you like, I think you can guess how I would answer the question, would Britain be safe in Boris's hands? There's nothing he's done to date that makes me think he is the right person to be Prime Minister, that he has a better idea or better qualifications to do the job than anyone else that we've thought of. He isn't someone who has proved himself again and again, so we would be doing it on trust, if you like. And I'm not sure that he deserves our trust in that way, or he hasn't proved that he deserves our trust in that way. He's 50 now, he needs to get on with it, he needs to show that he is trustworthy. But at the moment, I would vote no. But I'd like to know now how everyone here thinks. Okay, so